Right. In this video, we'll talk about Azure Storage Life Cycle policies. So one of the key feature which is available on Azure Storage, so which helps us in saving a lot of cost. So let's take some example. Let's say we have files, working files. So I'm working on some kind of a Word document or presentation or some Excel or some kind of document. So what we do generally typically, so we keep working on this document for a few days. And a few days, we actively work on this document. So we keep modifying this document, keep editing this document until we complete this document. So once we complete this document, we may submit this document to our customer or some purpose. Then once the document is being completed and successfully, then we may not access this particular file after completion. But still, we want those files. So we see in our laptops, we keep creating files, saving them, but we preserve them for a longer run. So we store those files for a longer run. Even though whether we access that files regularly or not, but still we keep those documents for longer duration. The reason is we may need it at a later point of time. At a later point of time. Generally, what do we do now? Let's say you have a laptop and the laptop is having a 1 TB storage. Now this 1 TB storage is full. The 1 TB storage is full. Now your laptop doesn't have any kind of a storage. The next step what we try to do is then how do we free up this space? So we see that are there any files which we can delete, which are not required? So first action we take called as delete the files which are not required. Which are not required. So we take this first action to release the space immediately. Then second, still we feel that there's no much space available and we feel that the files are very important, may be required after a few days or few months, but still we want to preserve. Then what do? We move the files from an hard disk to an USB, an external USB, or to the cloud storage or some cloud or external storages, or again we can call as an external storage. So by moving the files from this hard disk to external hard disk, so we are freeing up the space on the laptop. So one advantage here, I can save a lot of cost. So buying a 1 TB of an SSD hard disk is a bit expensive compared to buying of a 1 TB external storage, which is cheaper. So with that, what happens is we still preserve or keep these files for a longer duration, but the cost of the storage is less. Similarly, in Azure, so we have Azure blobs, Azure blob storage. So what happens in Azure blob storage? So we keep store files, what we call them as blobs. So we keep on storing the files, because we call them as blobs. Blobs. So now if you don't manage the storage properly, then we might incur in the huge storage cost. So what happens in this case now? When the files or blobs are stored in the Azure Blob Storage, so we have different options. One is we call it as a hot storage, we call it as a cool storage, then we call it as a cold storage, then we call it as an archive. Okay, storage. So by default, based on the storage account we created, the files will be stored on the hot storage or a cool storage or a cold storage or archive storage. The hot storage is a bit expensive, bit expensive. So when I mean bit expensive, the storage cost is bit less, but access cost is very high, very high. So if you really want to store the files which are regularly used and which needs the download speed faster than anything, then we can store the files in the storage, hard storage. But however, the cost is not very less, but it's okay. I would say call it as a moderate cost instead of we call it as a less. So the 1 TB storage. Now we have a cold storage. The storage cost is bit moderate, but access cost is also moderate. Moderate. So when you're so what happens when you compare now? Generally, what happens here now? If files which are created maybe before 3 months, which are not accessed within the 3 months of time, we can keep those kind of files in a cool storage, which can save a lot of cost. Here we are paying for access cost, but here, as we are not accessing them, the moderate. Similarly, we have cold storage. The cold storage also, the storage cost is bit low and access cost is also low, or I would say less. So when you store the files in a storage cost, cold storage, but what happens here is it is not recommended to store the files which are frequently accessed. Let's say you have some kind of files which are accessed by your website or web application, which every day they are being accessed. Now, it's not recommended to keep in the cold storage or cool storage because you need a faster access. If you have a file, anything which is regularly modified continuously, editing, writing, and modifying, then it is preferable to go for an hard storage. We have archive storage. So archive storage, what happens is storage cost is too less and access cost is also too less, but it takes a longer time for reading the data. It is something like an external storage, archive storage. If there are any files which you don't need them anymore, but still you want to keep it for a reference purpose or for some kind of an security or a legal purpose, then we can move the data to the archive storage. So that archive storage will automatically move the data, keep the data. But what happens here is that when you want to really read the data which is there in archive storage, it may takes couple of hours of time. So which is not immediately available to read the data. It is just like an external hard disk. So you have moved your data from the laptop local hard disk to an external hard disk. It is not available all the time. When you really want to access the data, then you have to connect your external storage and read the data, which typically takes some time. Similarly, in Azure Blob Storage. Now, what is the advantage of this one? So having this, so what I can do now, I can move the files from hard storage to cool storage. From cold storage to the archive. So initially, the files which are need to write a store into the storage, we can keep in a hard storage. And if you feel that there is a file which is not accessible from the last 3 months of time, but may be required, we can move that files into the cold storage, into the cool storage. And if we feel that still that file is not accessible or accessed in the last 180 days of time, or something, we can have that you can move to the cold storage to reduce the cost. And if you feel that after 6 months of time, still that file is not modified or read, but still want to preserve it, then we can move it to the archive storage. Let's say if you're having a 10 TB of storage consumed in a Azure hard storage, so which is might be costing you some around, let's say, an 4,000 rupees or a dollars. Now, when I move this 10 TB storage, which is not in use, to a cold storage, which is your cold storage, the same 10 TB cost might come down to the 3,000 rupees, which you are, if you are moving the same 10 TB storage, which might cost you 2,000 rupees. And if you are moving to the same storage of 10 TB into an unarchived storage, which might cost you some 500 rupees. So we see that there is a huge cost difference from an hard storage to an archive storage. So why do I need to pay for the files which I don't really use them? So in order to manage this data, now every day I cannot go and check the files, which files are older, which files are this. Now, the life cycle policies will automatically move the data from one storage tier to another storage tier based on the policy, or it can, the storage policies can allow us to delete the files automatically, can allows us to delete the files automatically. So this will help you that if there are files which are 6 years old, then which can delete them automatically. So now we don't need to be worried about that every day going and cleaning up an Azure storage account, which is costing heavy. We don't need to go and create an, or I would say called as an, move that files from a blob storage to an external storage or anything. So you can define a lifecycle policies where Azure can take care of moving that data from one tier to the another tier, and we can save a lot of cost. So let's go to the storage. Let me create a storage account. This is a very good feature which we will need it on the storage side, because otherwise what happens is the project teams, or sometimes we keep storing the data, whether it's useful or not useful, or whether we read it frequently or not frequently, but that will incur a lot of cost in the long run. Initially, we see that in the first month, we see a bill of some 1,000 rupees, we would be happy. But as we keep storing the data after 6 months of time, we see that a 10,000 rupees is being charged for the Azure storage account. Then we feel it is heavy. Now, how do we manage that cost? So once you have a storage account, so under a section called as a data management, we see called as life cycle management. Go to life cycle management. So create a policies. So I'm adding a rule. I'm saying move data to cool storage, which is older than 30 days. So I'm saying applying to all the blobs in the storage account, that is all the files, or you can have filter, like you want to have a filter for, you want to move only the files which are like in .mp4 files, .mpp4 files, or something kind of things. Blobs next, or do you want to apply to the snapshots, or do you want to apply to the versions? Then click on next. Now apply the rules. Blobs, base blobs, last modified or created. What do you want to consider? So when you go to the properties of a file, we see when was the file created, when was the file last modified. So do you want to take a decision based on the last modified or on the last created date? So I'm saying last modified. More than how many days? I'm saying that if a file has not been modified for the last 90 days of time, then what action I want to take? Do you want to delete the blob? Do you want to move it to the cool storage? Do you want to move it to the cold storage? Or do you want to move it to the archive storage or delete the blob? I'm saying code as in move to the cool storage. Now I'm creating add. You can have multiple conditions. Can have multiple conditions. Now, so I can move data to the cold storage, which is older than 90 days. So I'm saying another, I'm editing this policy. Add conditions. If blob was being last modified for a period of 190 days, or I would say called as in a 360 days, then I want to move it to the cold storage. Update it. Now what we did here now in the policy, we say that if the files are not modified in the last 90 days of time, move it to the cool storage. If the files are not modified in the cool storage for the past 1 year, then move it to the cold storage. Then I'm editing the policy and adding a condition. If the files are not modified more than, I would say, called as in 720 days, which is 2 years, then move it to the archive storage. Skip to the archive storage. Now like this, you can define the policies. Now what happens, we don't need to keep monitoring the data. So automatically, the Azure storage will move the data from one storage tier to another storage tier, which we can save a lot of cost. That's how you can use Azure lifecycle policies.